Okay, everyone. So it is our pleasure and our honor to have the last speaker of the conference, the last keynote, Professor Dermot Moran from Boston College. I think probably everyone knows who he is. So I give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you, Christos. And on behalf of everyone here, of course, I want to thank you for organizing this wonderful conference that has kept me mindful and alert for 3 days, well, 2.5 days. But I also want to thank the student assistants who have been here the whole time, working very hard to make sure everything is smooth. So if we don't get another chance, I just want to say thank you on behalf of everybody. My topic is Heidegger and Eckhart, and I'd like to begin with a personal reminiscence. As some of you know, I wrote my doctoral thesis on a medieval Irish philosopher called John Scotus Erugena while I was at Yale in the 1970s. But my original plan was to write a PhD on Heidegger, directed by my supervisor, Professor Carsten Harries, who was one of the few philosophers invited to contribute to Heidegger's 80th birthday Festschrift, published by Niemeyer in 1970. But Heidegger's death in May 76, at exactly when I was supposed to propose my thesis topic, admission to candidacy as it's called, caused a problem because I had been told that there was a whole Gesamtausgabe about to appear that would radically change the landscape of Heidegger studies. So my supervisor thought, given my background in scholasticism, that it would be better to focus on Heidegger and the scholastics. And in that case, Heidegger's Frühe Schriften, the very first of the Gesamtausgabe, had just been published, including his habilitation thesis on the categories and the doctrine of meaning in Duns Scotus. So it was for the first time possible to study Heidegger's own neo-scholastic origins, somewhat similar to my own. I was also aware of Heidegger's interest in Meister Eckhart, to whom Heidegger had promised to dedicate a book already in his dissertation. And I considered writing on him, but in the end, I decided to focus on someone who influenced Meister Eckhart, namely the Irish medieval Neoplatonist John Scotus Erugena, because his complex and subtle account of being and non-being seemed directly to challenge Heidegger's negative assessment of the medieval tradition in relation to the meaning of being. Indeed, Erugena's analysis of the various meanings of non-being, a genuine treatise on nothingness, in his Perifusion, seemed close in spirit to the musings of Heidegger on being and non-being in his 1929 inaugural lecture at Freiburg, What is Metaphysics? Indeed, this very existence of this medieval discussion of being and non-being seemed to me to refute Heidegger's claim about the Seinsvergessenheit of the medievals. So I wrote my dissertation on the meaning of being and non-being in John Scotus Erugena's Perifusion, published as a study of idealism in the Middle Ages about 10 years later. But my original interest was in Eckhart, to whom I now return. I'll say a few words about mindfulness, then about Heidegger's reading of Eckhart, and then about Eckhart's reading of Gelassenheit. We've been hearing about mindfulness for the past 3 days, and we realize it's a complex, multifaceted, possibly family resemblance concept. Broadly construed, it means something like moment-to-moment awareness of one's experiences without judgment, involving alert but focused and relaxed self-awareness. It seems to be a dwelling in the now. It is perhaps a form of lucid awakeness, as Jim Morley had said. It is certainly associated with a non-judgmental awareness and self-awareness that may be close to Husserl's concept of the epoche, as some have said. And of course, it can be and calls for translation in very different ways. Heidegger's text Besinnung has been translated as mindfulness. The French use the word pleine conscience, full awareness, to translate mindfulness. And I want to talk today then about something that may be mindfulness or a component of mindfulness, or at least related to mindfulness, and that is Gelassenheit, also translated as releasement, or in French, sérénité, serenity, calmness or composure, Gemütsruhe in German, but it is also known by Heidegger and by Eckhart as Abgeschiedenheit, detachment. So these are the two central terms, Gelassenheit and Abgeschiedenheit. The German term Gelassenheit comes from the verb lassen, which has the double meaning of to leave or to let, exactly like in English, to let somebody be, to leave them alone. But it also has the character of departure or letting go from or departing from. Gelassen as an adjective in regular German can mean calm or carefree, laid back, or even cool. And indeed, the term Gelassenheit has a very long history associated not just with Meister Eckhart, in Gelâzenheit in the medieval High German, Mittelhochdeutsch, but also with the Anabaptists and later, of course, even in Schelling. Here too, it has multiple meanings. Gelassenheit can mean self-surrender, self-abandonment, resignation to the divine will, acceptance or peace, serenity or calmness of mind. The related key term abgeschieden or abgescheiden in Mittelhochdeutsch in German can have the meaning in the noun der Abgeschiedene means the solitary one or the abandoned one, or in the case of the deceased, the dead, the deceased or the departed one. So Abgeschiedene means departed. In this sense, dead to the world. And this is a term that Eckhart uses. So Eckhart uses the term abgeschieden in precisely these meanings. Thus, in his treatise of uncertain date called von Abgescheidenheit, because in Middle High German, abgeschieden is Abgescheidenheit, he says, invoking St. Paul, the man who thus stands in utter detachment, in ganzer Abgescheidenheit, is wrapped into eternity in such a way that nothing transient can move him, and that he is aware of nothing corporeal, and is said to be dead to the world, der Welt tot, for he has no taste for anything earthly. Quotation from Eckhart. Note here that Gelassenheit has this character of distancing oneself from the transience of the world. And there's a certain sense in which that remains embedded in the meaning of letting be. I want to make a general remark now about the relationship between Gelassenheit and mysticism. Clearly, there are various, as we heard yesterday, there's been many intersecting traditions in the world, variously in India, Tibet, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Persia, ancient Greece, Egypt, and so on. But I want to stress that there is a specifically Western philosophical tradition, a sui generis form of mysticism that comes primarily from Dionysius the Areopagite, pseudo-Areopagite, because he was a Christian student of the late Platonist Proclus, but who masqueraded or presented himself as the first convert of St. Paul at Athens. Dionysius was translated from Greek into Latin by John Scotus Eriugena, which set in train a whole set of commentaries on Dionysius that lasted through the Middle Ages. And a scholar who was a friend of, or actually one of the teachers of Heidegger, Joseph Koch, pointed out that while Dionysius received commentaries from everyone, including Thomas Aquinas and later Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa, St. Augustine, who's another serious proponent of Western mysticism, was never commented at all. So there are no comments on St. Augustine, there are many on Dionysius. It was indeed Nicholas of Cusa, cardinal in the 15th century, who deliberately connected Eriugena and Eckhart as being involved in the same Dionysian tradition of negative theology, the via negativa. This involved a kind of mystical unknowing, the docta ignorantia of Nicholas of Cusa, that involves a deliberate exercise of detaching oneself from images and concepts of the divine that are perhaps too contentful or affirmative, and therefore by purifying oneself through a series of negations. For Eriugena, as for Dionysius, as for Eckhart, as for Cusanus, it is verius et altius, truer and higher, to say that God is not, non-est, rather than to say that God is. God is, if you like, the unsayable. And his deliberately called, and I'll come back to this, nihil or nothing in Eugenia and Eckhart, in a way that Japanese scholars have seen as very close to the Zen tradition. And there's a lot of writing about in Japanese philosophy about the influence of Eckhart as a Western Zen Buddhist master. Eckhart's work was revived in the 19th century in Germany and became popular in the early 20th century by Paul Natorp and others. But aside from Heidegger, almost nobody commented on him in the phenomenological tradition, except Heidegger's own student, Käte Oltmanns, and later Max Scheler, scattered throughout his work. And more recently, again, Reiner Schürmann, who was from an Alsace Dominican who went to America and taught at the New School for Social Research. More recently, Eckhart has been taken up by Jacques Derrida in his discussion about how not to speak, and also Jean-Luc Marion. I'll skip over. There was a student of Husserl, Gerd de Walter, a woman who wrote Zur Phänomenologie der Mystik in 1923, who treated mystical experiences as sui generis forms of givenness, the first phenomenological treatment of mystical experience as a special form of Gegebenheit. But she doesn't have any reference to Eckhart except to link him in one sentence to Buddhism. However, Heidegger's Marburg student, Käte Oltmanns, who wrote her doctoral thesis on Eckhart, later published as Die Philosophie des Meister Eckhart in 1935, read Eckhart in the terms of Heidegger's Dasein in Being and Time, seeing freedom as the essence of the human being. And this book was championed by Heidegger, although it was reviewed somewhat negatively at the time, with scholars claiming that Oltmanns had a rather cavalier way of interpreting Eckhart manuscripts, very similar to Heidegger's own way of treating the Greeks. In other words, it was Oltmanns said she thought this was genuine or not genuine based on what she took to be the text of the work. Briefly, I'll refer to Reiner Schürmann, who studied at the Sorbonne in the 1960s and wrote a very, very important, still important work on Eckhart in French, Meister Eckhart et la joie errante. And in an essay, he correctly summarizes Heidegger's use of Eckhart. Schürmann wrote, whenever Heidegger mentions Eckhart, the context is a development of Heidegger's own essential thought, namely being that lets beings be, gelâzenheit, the thinging of the thing, understood as the nearing of the world, man's essence needed by being to uphold his truth, thinking as thanking, the unspoken speech that bestows a world, and last but not life, living without why, Ohne Warum. Schürmann studied with a friend of Heidegger's, Bernhard Welter, in Freiburg in the late 60s, and he wrote to Heidegger personally, asking him some questions about Eckhart. And in his letter of 1966, which survives, Schürmann says, he's writing to Heidegger, there are two questions I particularly would like to ask you. The first concerns Eckhart's relevance to the situation in which thinking finds itself today. Did he perhaps think being as self-sending, as only eventfully experienceable? Meister Eckhart's sole thought is aimed at the unification of the separated soul with God. Insofar as the soul lets all things be, it breaks through to the ground where the Godhead continuously creates all things, and which in this breakthrough also becomes my ground. The unity is a unity of the fabric in which God operates, and I become son, that is. Being is thus thought as course of experience and not represented as ontic standing reserve. This was in his letter to Eckhart. Schürmann continues in his letter to make this penetrating observation. Quote, I have in mind above all this one word, thou. The mystery of the gift could be experienced as mystery of the thou, without thinkings having to fall into representation, while it remains within the boundaries set to it as thinking. Even in the break through all of God's titles, such as goodness or truth, there still subsists for Meister Eckhart the inkling of the thou. Might not the proposition being is given, es gibt sein, be expressed in the form thou gives being, du gibst sein, without injury to the mystery. Schürmann, in that really penetrating passage, was asking Heidegger if Eckhart's experience of being was really of a thou, that the es gibt was really a du gibt, something that one would, of course, think closer to perhaps someone like Levinas. Unfortunately, we don't. Heidegger and Schürmann met, and Schürmann wrote his book on Eckhart and Heidegger, but we don't have Heidegger's response to that letter. But Heidegger's connection to Eckhart is not just only through Schürmann. Many other scholars, including Werner Bayer-Waltes and more recently Ian Moore, have studied Eckhart's influence on Heidegger. Heidegger draws quite widely and variously on Eckhart's central concepts, in all of which appear first in Eckhart and are used by Heidegger. Gottheit, the Godhead, Abgeschiedenheit, or detachment, Gelassenheit, or releasement as it's often translated, Wesung, the presencing, and the living Ohne Warum, without a why. But it is clear that Heidegger distances himself from Eckhart's strong sense of the personal God in the soul. Heidegger's focus is on the nature of grounding and groundlessness, and the capacity of thinking in a way that remains open to the event of being. Heidegger embraced Eckhart very early on. His most earliest exposure seems to have been already in Freiburg in the winter semester of 1910-11, where he attended the lectures of the church historian Josef Sauer, Geschichte der mittelalterlichen Mystik, the history of the medieval mystics. And Heidegger himself later recalls in his Schwarze Hefte, my previous study of Aristotle over the years facilitated my first attempt in 1913 to 1915 to think alongside Meister Eckhart, who belongs in the slim kinship, geringe Verwandtschaft of the first thinkers. Heidegger acknowledges, as I learned for myself to read Eckhart, in other words, he's sort of self-taught, but he briefly mentions Eckhart, as I said earlier, in his 1915 habilitation thesis, where he states, I hope to be able to show on another occasion how Eckhartian mysticism is given its proper philosophical interpretation and assessment only from this point of view in connection with the metaphysics of the problem of truth. We don't have, obviously, this text, but we do know, many people have told us about the importance of Eckhart, continuing importance of Eckhart for Heidegger. Thus, Hans-Georg Gadamer wrote, Meister Eckhart played a particularly great role for Heidegger. At that time, 1924, the Opus Tripartitum, Meister Eckhart's Latin magnum opus, had just been re-edited. Heidegger was completely fascinated by it, evidently because the dissolution of the concept of substance in regard to God pointed in the direction of a temporal and verbal sense of being, when it will be said that esse est Deus. At that time, Heidegger may have suspected an ally in the Christian metaphysics. So in his early 1920-21 lectures on the phenomenology of religious life, Heidegger has several notes on Abgeschiedenheit. He mentions the original form that it appears in the mystics and its relation to what he calls Weltzugewandtheit, or that is familiarity with the ways of the world, a concept found in Luther, and which he identifies with humilitas, or humility. Heidegger is primarily thinking of Abgeschiedenheit here in relation to Luther, in a way of kind of detachment from familiarity with the ways of the world. He writes, detachment, these are only notes, not a theoretical not seeing, kein theoretisches Nichtsehen, sondern emotionales, in seiner Urform eben religios, corresponding to the ways of what he says is some kind of repulsion. You can hear later on Heidegger's notion of being in the world and the way in which we are weltbefangen, we are captivated by the world, and some way of finding some kind of self-distanciation. So already in 1921, in these lectures on religious life, Heidegger says, generally speaking, what we need is a detachment that's not just negative, but also has a positive side. one that is at work even as we direct ourselves to the world. This positive unification through detachment would primarily not be of a religious nature, but rather of a lived, emotional, religious experience. Here there is something irrational about his central concept, Abgeschiedenheit. Heidegger returned to Eckhart in more detail, especially in his 1944-45 Feldwegsgespräch, his conversations on a country path, which I just learned, some of which were given in the monastery of Buron, where Heidegger and the department of the Freiburg philosophy department had decamped to avoid the bombings in Freiburg at the end of the war. And Heidegger gave these lectures there on Meister Eckhart, while having an affair with a German count. I only discovered that, so that's also interesting. But he gave these lectures on Gelassenheit, and later on in 1955, in his hometown of Meßkirch, he gave his small pamphlet Gelassenheit as part of his memorial address on the local-born composer Konradin Kreutzer. Now, Heidegger's engagement now in the 40s and 50s is in the context of reflections on the nature of rootedness, Bodenständigkeit, or belonging to one's locality, as well as thinking about the enframing technology, technological enframing, and die Flucht von dem Denken, the flight from thought, which is which is a part of what he called calculative thinking, and which can only be saved through what he called a kind of saving thinking or meditative thinking. Sometimes he calls it Nachdenken, sometimes he calls it Andenken, sometimes he calls it Besinnung. This, he says, is not a kind of will thinking, nor is it a passivity. Rather, it is a kind of waiting, warten. And then he says in sort of Taoist style way that the way is a way of Nachdenken. Dieser Weg ist ein Weg von Nachdenkens. Here he says we need to combine what he calls Gelassenheit zu den Dingen. This is not a Eckhartian term, it's a Heideggerian term. Gelassenheit, letting be towards things, as well as what he calls die Offenheit für das Geheimnis, an openness for the mystery, in order to overcome the dominance of what he calls Machenschaft or machination, or the technological productivity that has taken over everything. So he says, but he says in this Feldwegsgespräch, in this country path conversation, that such Gelassenheit has nothing to do with putting the human will aside to let in the divine will. He says this, it's not an abwerfen or throwing aside of the human will in order for a let in, Herrenlassen, of the divine will. Certainly, he says, what we have called releasement evidently does not mean casting off sinful selfishness and letting self-will go in favor of divine will. In his 1955 Gelassenheit memorial address, he said, I would like to call this comportment towards technology, I think it was quoted by one of the speakers in the last few days, I would call this comportment towards technology which expresses ja sagen, and at the same time nicht, no saying, by an old word, namely die Gelassenheit zu den Dingen, this openness or letting go towards things. Heidegger wants to deliberately extricate Gelassenheit from its theological context as he had found it in Eckhart, and apply it especially to a kind of mindfulness in relation to technology. And here, Gelassenheit is opposed primarily to what he calls representational thinking. He says, previously we have come to see thinking in the form of a transcendental horizontal representing. And in his Feldwegsgespräch, he spends a lot of time analyzing this nature of transcendence and horizon that needs to be part of our experience of things. So he says, releasement towards things and openness to the mystery never happen by themselves. They do not befall us accidentally. Both flourish only through persistent, courageous, herzhaften, heartful thinking. Here, Heidegger's Gelassenheit is a form of non-representational, non-willed, self-aware, Andenken or Nachdenken, meditative thinking. Some people speak about memorial thinking that is neither active nor passive. It involves, he says, renouncing, ablassen, but it also involves involving oneself, sich einlassen, into a kind of non-objectifying thinking directed towards what he calls the open, for which he uses an old German word, die Gegend or Gegend. He writes in the Feldwegsgespräch, you see that the horizon is the open which surrounds us. But what is this opening as such? If we discard that, it can also appear as the horizon of our representing. It is, Heidegger says, a region, or what is called Gegend as it's translated. Now, it seems to me that this involves a change of emphasis in the later Heidegger in his relationship to Gelassenheit from his earlier concerns in the teens and 20s. In the 20s, i.e. his early Freiburg lectures, he references Luther and the capacity of being befangen, or captivated by the world, and his concerns consist of highlighting perhaps the nature of our Sorge, or being cared for in the world, but in a way which detaches itself from the kind of Gewöhnlichkeit or ordinariness of our everyday existence, Alltäglichkeit. Detachment, as he wrote then, was primarily a religious impulse to distance oneself from the world. But in the 40s and 50s, he seems much more preoccupied to detachment from any kind of religious umbrella or worldview, and to present it as a remedy to technological calculative thinking. Even Gestell perhaps has an Eckhartian provenance for Eckhart, because in a series of late reflections written around 1972 or 3, he says that the term Gestell, the Eckhartian term Gestellness should be a translation of the Latin word forma. So it's possible that Heidegger even found the term Gestell, which really means frame. I mean, your bicycle frame is a Gestell in German. But the idea that the whole technological framing is characterized by a single characteristic, that's very much this Heideggerian impact that perhaps came from Eckhart. Right, I want to turn now to Eckhart himself. As the scholar of mysticism Bernard McGinn has observed, Gelassenheit and Abgeschiedenheit are perhaps the two central terms in Eckhart that appear everywhere, and especially in his vernacular works. I should say very briefly that Meister Eckhart was a German Dominican who studied at Paris and indeed took Thomas Aquinas' chair. Thomas was also a Dominican at Paris, and he held the chair for 2 periods, and he wrote mostly in Latin, so he wrote a great deal of typical commentaries and texts in Latin. But then he was sent to Cologne in Germany, yes, and into the lowlands, where he was primarily a preacher in religious convents of nuns, many of whom were uneducated. And there he spoke in German, Middle High German, and these sermons were written down and preserved. So there's 2 Eckharts, if you like, the Latin and the German works, and they're published in 2 separate editions. And some people find it hard to reconcile the scholarly German Master of Arts at Paris with the Dominican lecturer. And some people thought for a long time that the German ones were more radical. They were preaching a way to open up to the religious, to detachment and letting go of everything. But now there's a recognition that even the Latin ones discuss this also. But it is important to point out that perhaps a central text, although we've no idea if Heidegger ever read it, but he certainly never cited it, is this one on Abgescheidenheit and on detachment, which Eckhart wrote in German. I'm going to skip on a little bit. In this text, Eckhart discusses Abgeschiedenheit, detachment, as a virtue, Tugend, German virtue. And he relates it to other virtues, including, as we'll see, compassion and love and justice and various other virtues. So he goes through the virtues and says that it says that detachment is higher than all of them. Furthermore, he thinks that detachment has scriptural authority and is central to the inner message of the Christian. Thus, he thinks that not only the pagan masters, as he says, but the Old Testament prophets and the New Testaments all have extolled this highest virtue for human beings, namely detachment. So he writes in the sermon, Misit Dominus Manum Suum, God put out his hand, when I preach, I'm accustomed to speak about detachment and that a man should be free of himself and of all things. Secondly, that a man should be formed again into that simple good which is God. Thirdly, he should reflect on the great nobility with which God has endowed his soul, so that he may come to wonder at God. And fourth, about the purity, lûterkeit or lauterkeit, of the divine nature, for the brightness of the divine nature is beyond words. This list of 4 themes has rightly been recognized as a summary of Eckhart's teaching. Abgeschiedenheit, transformation into the divine, the nobility of the soul and the simplicity of the divine. But note that he puts detachment first. And in his treatise on detachment, he quotes Christ's injunction to Martha, one thing alone is necessary, coming from Luke, to mean that whoever wants to be free of care and be pure must have one thing, and that is detachment. In order to, I'll come back to what he has to say about this detachment, but in order to conceptualize it a little bit, I think we need to understand it within Eckhart's overall metaphysical scheme. As a Neoplatonist and a follower of Dionysius, Eckhart assumes that the true reality, the all, is a complete and total unity, a transcendent one, which in no sense is to be understood as being. It is beyond being, as in the good in Plato's Republic. As Burkhard Moisisch, who's a scholar working on Eckhart, has said, Eckhart contends that the absolute principle is pure intellect and not being. And this is something that Eckhart defends, especially in his Latin Parisian questions, where he argues that intellect is higher than being, but the one is higher than intellect. This all-embracing unity can be said to be pure, naked, devoid of individuating characteristics, ohne Eigenschaft, without properties. A desert is a term that Eckhart uses, die Wüste in German, a wasteland, a transcendent nothing. This pure unity is kind of infinite, transcendent emptiness, and as such, it may properly be called non-being or nothing, or super-essential being. All of the terms can be found in Eckhart, both in Latin and in German, but sometimes put forward in, if you like, paradoxical terms. And Eckhart is a very, very paradoxical thinker in that respect. Many of the Japanese Zen Buddhists see him in that way of thinking by sort of proposing you to sort of think something shockingly the opposite. Eckhart knew Eugenes' works, and Eugenes speaks of God as the oppositio oppositorum, the opposite of opposites. And indeed, Meister Eckhart will use the same phrase, as will later Cusanus, who speaks of the opposite of opposites without opposition. God is beyond all things, but is also the negatio omnium, that is the negation of all things. God is nothing of all things, Eckhart says, nihil omnium. And Eckhart himself refers to the 12th century Book of the 24 Philosophers, where God is represented as a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And this is, in fact, one of the images that Heidegger himself comments on. Eckhart's God, then, is not a God who can be encountered in ordinary religious practice. And indeed, rather like the Zen Buddhists, Eckhart says many times, you have to jettison all your concepts of the divine. Your practice, if you like, your almsgiving, these are as nothing. It is better to say that God is nothing than to fixate on any description of God, no matter how theologically well crafted. Furthermore, Eckhart places a great emphasis on the closeness, Gleichheit or Gleichheit, the likeness of the human to God. This is, of course, a development of the old image of the imago Dei. But in Eckhart, he emphasizes that all creatures strive, as I'm quoting him, and toil out of their natures to become like God. The heavens would not revolve if they were not striving and searching for God or a likeness of God. I should just say here that in the Neoplatonic system, everything wants to become one. Everything is one in some respect, and it wants to become one. And it becomes one towards being. The one doesn't do anything. Things want to be like the one. The one in itself is detached. All things like to be it, but it doesn't have to do anything. And Eckhart talks about the mind that wants to empty itself out and become one with the divine as ultimately requiring detachment. As several people, including Reiner Schürmann, observed, this detachment undoubtedly has parallels with the Stoic concept of apatheia, except that the Stoics seek to achieve this through a strengthening of the will, whereas Eckhart recommends abandoning the will. Thus, in his treatise on detachment, Eckhart says, you should know that true detachment is nothing else but a mind that stands unmoved, unbeweglich, by all accidents of joy or sorrow or honor or shame or disgrace, as a mountain of lead stands unmoved by a breath of wind. Eckhart goes on to immediately talk about this immovable detachment that brings a human being into the greatest equality with God. And this is what he says: for the reason why God is because of his immovable detachment, von seiner unbeweglichen Abgescheidenheit. And from this detachment, God has his purity, lûterkeit, and his simplicity and his immutability. Note what Eckhart is saying here. It is precisely the property of detachment, or the state of detachment, that makes God to be God. And it is this property that founds and underlies all the other properties of the divine, including unchangeability and purity. Abgescheidenheit, then, is a fundamental principle that is in its way ontologically prior to God. It makes God to be God, he says, in various ways. And it is in itself, as he says, detachment rests in itself. It does not wish to be above or below any creature. It merely wants to be, but it does not wish to be this or that. And then he writes, therefore, if a man is to be like God, so far as a creature can have likeness with God, this must come from detachment. So what human beings achieve through detachment and through becoming receptive is nothing other than being open to the divine itself. And Eckhart develops this in many, many different ways, to the point where, of course, he was accused later of pantheism, of a sort of merging of the human and the divine. But his argument is that all of these, if you like, put it in Buddhist terms, all of these forms emerge from the original formlessness. And the original formlessness, there's no separation between the human and the divine. Detachment, then, for Eckhart, has the status of a fundamental principle, a metaphysical principle, as well as he says, the highest virtue. It is the first virtue because all other virtues depend on it. Detachment, moreover, expresses a freedom from creation. The pure, detached heart stands free of all creatures. He says this many times. And this is another point, you find this in Eriugena also, that Gottheit, or the Godhead, is not the same as God. There is, if you like, a hidden God and a manifest God. The manifest God is the God who is involved in creation. The hidden God is the God who's the source even of the manifest God. So there is a kind of godliness or Godheit, godness, deitas in Latin, which is a fundamental position of the universe, and which he says is nothing. In order to think this nothing, we have to abandon images. And this undoubtedly brings Meister Eckhart's notion of Gelassenheit close to Heidegger's version of non-representational thinking. We must let go of images, images trap and imprison us in certain ways of thinking, And if the mind is to be open to the reception of the divine, it must, Eckhart says, rest on absolutely nothing, since nothing has the greatest receptivity. Elsewhere, he says, the object of a detached heart is neither this nor that. Eckhart says, detachment is receptive of nothing but God. As soon as the image comes in, God and all his divinity have to give way. But as soon as the image goes out, God comes in. Pure detachment, then, which is the same, it isn't any effort. It is rediscovering of the original unity between the mind and God, can only occur when one has, if you like, lost oneself, not just to the world, but to all imaging. He writes, now pay attention diligently and earnestly. I have already said it several times, and a great master says it as well. This is usually Avicenna or someone. Man is supposed to be detached in such a way from all things and all works, both internal and external, that he becomes God's own sight in which God could act. Elsewhere, he says that the aim is to be empty and free, and to experience oneself as free of all creatureliness. Because at that point, when one empties oneself of one's own, if you like, attachment to one's own creaturely status, one becomes void of all forms, free of all names, he says, and free to be or to experience the divine in oneself. That, he writes, that man alone is pleasing to God who is detached and removed from all transient things. That man who is most detached and has most forgotten all transient things is most pleasing to God and therefore nearest to God. So he then writes, and I'm coming to my close now, he focuses on the central Christian virtue, which is love. He says, the teachers greatly praise love, as does St. Paul, who says, whatever things I may do and have not love, I am nothing. This is what Eckhart said, but I extol detachment above any love. First, because at best, love constrains me to love God, but detachment compels God to love me. It is a far nobler thing, my constraining God to me, than for me to constrain myself to God. That is because God is more able to adapt himself to me and can more easily unite with me than I could with God. Detachment forces God to me. And he says these things. Now, detachment, he says, comes so close to nothing that between perfect detachment and nothing, nothing can exist. Therefore, perfect detachment is without humility, he says. Furthermore, it is higher than compassion, barmherzlichkeit. He writes, I also praise detachment above all compassion. For compassion is nothing but a man's going out of himself by reason of his fellow creatures' lack, by which his heart is troubled. But detachment is free of all of this. It stays in itself and is not troubled by anything. For as long as anything can trouble a man, he's not in a right state. In short, when I consider all the virtues, I find none so completely without lack and so conform to God as detachment. Furthermore, he says, detachment rests on nothingness. And the topic of nothingness in Eckhart has been much discussed, the nothingness of the divine, by commentators who related to Indian Shankara and to Japanese Zen Buddhism. But in my view, and I think it's pretty obvious from the textual transmission, it clearly belongs to the Dionysian tradition coming from Dionysius and Eriugena. Eriugena actually thinks nothing is a term justified by scripture for application to God, and Eckhart quotes that, and he explicates God in terms of nothingness. He writes at one point, and I'm coming to my conclusion, you should love God as he is, i.e. non-God, non-spirit, non-person, and non-image. Rather, he is sheer, pure, limpid one, ein lûter, pure, klar, ein, detached from all duality, gesundert von aller Zweiheit. So here's a oneness detached from all duality, that is a pure nothing, and so on. So I come to my conclusion. I have been outlining a concept of detachment and releasement, Abgeschiedenheit and gelâzenheit, two versions of the same thing. In Eckhart, I've been showing some of their relationship, some of the ways they were taken up by Heidegger, but I think there's much left to be reflected on, and especially the manner in which they are a sui generis form of Western Christian mysticism. It certainly, I haven't here concentrated on whether this detachment is mindfulness or not, but certainly it does have the flavor of, and Eckhart often says it, of being something very similar to at least the Zen Buddhist, which perhaps is the one I have the most familiarity with, concepts, because detachment from attachment to detachment is central to Eckhart's view. That, you know, a bit like the Pharisees getting puffed up with their generosity, getting attached to detachment, getting so full of one's own mindfulness that one becomes absorbed by it, is for Eckhart as the biggest form of Weltbefangenheit, of being drawn and captivated by the world. The whole point is to have a detachment from all things, including from detachment itself. So he writes about that. I won't go on, but I have many, many quotations here. But it's similar to what Heidegger is saying, although not the same, but they need to be thought perhaps in parallel. Heidegger says in his Gespräch, Gelassenheit and openness to the mystery belong together. They grant us the possibility of dwelling in the world in a totally different way. Now, Eckhart's Gelassenheit and Abgeschiedenheit, in the use of medieval terms, do contribute, I think, to at least notions that balance one from notions of philosophical contemplation, theoria, disputatio, dialectica, gnostica theoria, and so on. My own view is somewhat influenced by studying some Zen Buddhism, as I had in the past, and Zen meditation with a teacher who was sort of eclectic and avoided attachment to either the Rinzai or the social traditions, but had a great way of expressing the basic insights of meditation with the three phrases that he would often repeat during these sessions of Zazen. Mind yourself. No mind. Never mind. So thank you very much.
We have about 40 minutes for Q&A, and we'll start with Mahon.
Thanks very much, Al. Fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading it carefully, learning a lot as we go along. And I wondered if you'd expand on something a little bit that I'd be curious, especially given your expertise, how you would do this. But Heidegger's clear with Gelassenheit, even in some of the phrases, it's releasement or Gelassenheit or thing is always the thing. And one of the things that comes out in Virginal a lot is that he's really worried, and the Bremen lectures lost, or maybe we never even had the ability to let things be as things. And he emphasizes the as a bit here. And I was wondering then, part of what needs to be maybe fed in is just how impressed he had been by Sterling account of technology. He's not going to say that out loud, but that does seem to be playing a big part in retrieving the thing.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your take.
Well, I mean, thank you. It's of course a complicated story because you heard me read here that one of the things that Schürmann says Heidegger got from Eckhart was a concept of the thinking of the thing. And Eckhart often begins by asking us to think about something very particular. And, you know, then his notion of the divine is not that. And he has this phrase, it's not this or that. But the idea, but then he goes round to the other way of thinking that even in any single, you know, you can see all heaven in a grain of sand kind of thing. He does often say that if you think about anything in its depth, it sort of reveals its Abgrund in nothingness or something like that. And yes, that is, I think, a basic insight he got from Husserl, with the notion that in perception, in all perception and thinking, while the thing is given to us, we are only given, it's only ever given to us under an aspect or under a profile, and that there's a horizon of other unseen or unknown ways, which is still somehow present, you know, hovering in some way. But and he says this actually very clearly in the Gefeldwegsgespräch, where he talks about what he calls this horizontal transcendental way of thinking, that we recognize something, but we also feel that can't be the whole of it, as it were. But that it also has a form of givenness which is unique to itself. He talks about this, as you know, and you quoted from them, the cup, thinking about the cup in the what is a thing and elsewhere, so that the emptiness of the whole form of the cup is part of the cup, but it can't ever be expressed in the physics of the cup, if you like. So he thinks that what he calls, broadly speaking, this calculus of thinking, or this scientific thinking that thinks of things in terms of their elements, misses their Sinnlichkeit, if you like. So Besinnung is meant to be a sort of capturing of the Sinn of things. And there's a lot in Eckhart about this, because Eckhart also says about the stone, he says a stone is a stone is a stone, a bit like the rose is a rose. But he also says that the sort of isness of the stone is this divine istigkeit, this isness, which again, he used the phrase istigkeit, Eckhart does, which is taken up by Heidegger and referenced with relation to Eckhart. So there's something like the experience of isness, Latin esse, takes us out of the realm of the individual thing, property, as he says, Eigenschaft, but and brings us to some space where we grasp things in a different way. But yeah, sure, that's the interconnection between the two.
Jim?
Thank you so much. Eckhart is part of the European mystical tradition, I could call it that.
Yeah.
That was the containing vessel of all that, and took it in, and the rest of it was to take it out from him. So he's really important, and it's amazing how uncovered he was for so many centuries. But
Yeah.
my question is this: now, Dionysius the Areopagite was widely read in the Eastern Byzantine Church. There's no problem with Dionysius. He was widely accepted.
Yeah.
You know, he was, in fact, you could almost call him the Aquinas of the Byzantine era.
Yeah.
But you know, when I open up Eckhart, I remember when I first opened up Eckhart, I went right to the theological writings. It was dead stuff. It wasn't the same. It's like his mystical teachings are hidden.
Yeah.
He's like always speaking with two tongues. He's like very careful and cautious. And then you go to the lectures, the sermons, and even there he's danced, but he's coming out more. He's out with it a bit more. That's because he thinks it's safe, the vernacular with the nuns. You know? But what I want to ask is, why this tension? He couldn't. It's like he was in the closet. And what's going on with the church politics there? Is there something inherent to the
there's a huge
tradition that just this kind of
Well, I mean, look, it's a huge issue. I mean, well, let's start with the simplest thing. There is no Dionysius the Areopagite. There's the Acts of the Apostles, where St. Paul, this Jewish missionary, arrives to speak to the philosophers at the Areopagus, which is their court, their public. I've actually been on it. It's a very slippy rock. It's right beside the Acropolis in Athens. And it was a kind of Hyde Park in London. All kinds of crazies would go there and speak. And St. Paul goes there, and he's telling them that you have a statue to the unknown God. Well, this is the God I'm here to represent. And he's before all the other gods, right? And seemingly the audience was largely Stoic. And by the way, St. Paul's references to philosophers are usually to the Stoics, whom he regarded as materialists. And he's saying, no, you yourselves, you Greek philosophers, have within you this tradition of the unknown God, agnothon theos. And so nobody came forward except two people. One of them mentioned as Dionysius, and the other was a woman called, nobody knows anything about her either. Anyway, her name will come back to me. But we have then 600 years later, these works start circulating, thought to be the works of Dionysius the Areopagite, because the person presents themselves as. But it's clear, and it wasn't recognized until Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century, that these works are not using, first century scriptural terminology, but are using Proclean terminology of the 6th century Neoplatonic tradition. So we now think that this Dionysius, the author of the works of the pseudo-Dionysius, was probably a Syrian student, given the Greek, the Syrian student of Proclus, who is a Christian and who is presenting, as the late Platonists did, that beyond the good and being and truth and goodness and all the other Platonic forms, there's the one, and even beyond the one, there's a meon huperton, you know, there's, and that non-being is where everything resides and the source of all things and all the rest of that.
It's all out there.
And so it's all out there in Dionysius. And so, but Dionysius, because he's considered to be the student of Paul, has been given a reverence equivalent to, these are like the four Gospels. There's the four Gospels, there's the Pauline letters, and there's the Acts of the Apostles, and there is this set of texts, the Corpus Dionysiacum. So they had an enormous influence, and to this day, and there may be experts on this in this room, the Greek Orthodox tradition recognizes Dionysius as a saint. A friend of mine told me he was in Mount Athos, and there was a reading after one of the masses, and the reading was from Dionysius. He recognized it because he was a student of studying Dionysius' philosophy. So, but it was in the West that they decided that for linguistic, philological grounds, it couldn't be. But that didn't, you know, but Thomas Aquinas thought the works were genuine, Albertus Magnus thought they were genuine, Eckhart thought they were genuine. But they do represent this idea of the mystical ascent. By the way, has Pauline justification. Paul is talked about having been wrapped up in the third heaven. So a lot of these scholars commenting on it think that Paul saw, you know, Paul got into unity with the divine. And Dionysius, who was a student telling you how to do this, and here it is, especially in the text, short text, Mystical Theology, that Dionysius wrote, where he refers to God as beyond all, you know, substance and non-substance and being and non-being, and gives you this paradoxical thing. Eckhart is aware of that, but also his reading it also is the most sophisticated of the late scholastic, because he knew the works of Maimonides, where something of the same negative traditions to be found. He knew the works of Avicenna and Averroes, as well as being the successor of Thomas Aquinas. So what he does is he presents this whole system, you know, as being, this is the sort of inner truth of the Christian movement, like saying detachment is higher than love, for example. But even in the Latin works, there's this notion that intellect is prior to being. What happened was he was sent off to preach to the women's convents, which were hotbeds of very radical religious fervor, and the brethren of the free spirit, and our words today, the beghards and the beguine, you know, the very radical, blessed are the poor in spirit. Eckhart has a whole sermon on that. And poverty of spirit means emptying everything out, complete emptiness. And he didn't write these lectures down, they were written down by people in the audience and circulated. And eventually got back to Rome, and they called him up for an inquisition. And somebody went through the trouble of going through his works and finding a whole set of very paradoxical statements that were capable of being considered heretical. And Eckhart was called to answer them. And he wrote a reply, but then he was called to, the Pope at that time was in Avignon, and he walked to Avignon, and then he died on the way. So he was never actually formally condemned. So I'm a member of the Eckhart Society, and some of the members of it, one of them were Dominicans. They wrote to the Pope and said, listen, can you lift the suspension on Eckhart? And this is John Paul II, what he did was actually clever. He didn't, but he started referring to Eckhart in sermons. That sort of rehabilitated him in the Vatican manner, right? So Eckhart is now rehabilitated. So it is the hidden tradition. And indeed, the works of Eckhart were considered suspect, as were the works of Eriugena. And that tradition disappears in the Western Catholic tradition, especially in the Counter-Reformation, but entered in through Bruno and into Schelling and the 19th century German idealists, who were the ones who actually revived Eckhart, and the Romantics. But there is one dark side to that story, which was that the early 20th century was a huge revival of Eckhart. And Heidegger was part of that. And he was considered like an existentialist along with Kierkegaard. But in the 30s, in the Nazi sort of National Socialist thing, Albertus Magnus and Eckhart were seen as the first German philosophers. And they were seen as Teutonic figures, glorifying, Aryan virtues. And so they were presented in a different way. And that caused all kinds of problems with the edition of Eckhart. To this day, there are people who regard Eckhart as, like Heidegger, as someone that is a bit too suspect to be brought into clear light of day. But sorry for a very long answer, but that's the history of it.
One quick follow-up. Was he a pantheist?
Yes and no, because the pantheism chart, I've actually written on this for Eugen Eckhart and Cusanus. They're all accused of pantheism. It's an easy accusation. Even Hegel has this idea. The most theological thinking is of a God who is in relationship to creation. But God, as Eckhart says, is detached. It's the one who knows nothing, right? It's the person outside the window, and we all turn our heads to look at them go by. They don't know they're being looked at. So the one doesn't know anything about this world, right? The world wants to be like the one. So that's, if you like, there's a way in which you have to think of the divine as being entirely detached. And Eckhart says there's a part of us, which relates to the mindfulness thing, the scintilla animae, or the spark in the soul, or the interior castle, is given all kinds of names, which is this inner immovable center to the self that belongs to this nothing. Right? Now, the two are the same. So if that's pantheism, yes, but in fact, in terms of the created nature, this is all, Eckhart says that on that part of the soul, that spark in the soul, is uncreated. It's got him into trouble. So he thinks there's an original divine unity of all things, if you like, prior to manifestation. Formlessness prior to form. Put it like that. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question.
Please, yeah.
Which I'm not sure how useful, or if you can respond to it. So I've been reading the Phenomenology of Religious Life for ages, and it's so rich, and I always miss. So I didn't notice the references to Meister Eckhart.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought about a possible role he might have played there. And I want to ask you if pursuing this line of thought might be useful. So it is widely acceptable, I think, in Heidegger scholarship that when Heidegger speaks about being towards the parousia there, that's the first version of authenticity we get, which shares the same chirological structure as being towards death in being and time. There is an argument between scholars about whether they are the same or whether it's a different sort of authenticity. And then my question is that maybe you can get from the first one to the second if you think about the parousia. Maybe if you said an influence of Meister Eckhart there was where the parousia or God would be the nothing. So maybe that's the missing, might be a missing link, and whereby basically we can speak of a certain, well, God being the nothing, and which is both a sort of theology, but also a detheologized, because there is a total absence of God. And then you get solus ipse in the sense of, not in the sense of not having intersubjectivity, but in the sense of being abandoned by God, or there's nothing, he doesn't manifest himself in any way.
He has that notion. Just commenting on that. Well, let's remember what these lectures were to be. Heidegger, we'll go back a little bit to Husserl, wanted to give jobs to all his students. And he wanted to give them different regions of being. And he thought that the best thing to give Heidegger, because he came from a Catholic background, was philosophy of religion. Heidegger by then had converted to being a Protestant. But he was still looking for jobs in Catholic universities. And Heidegger thought that one of the ways to do this was to present himself as rethinking scholasticism. Well, what he says he wants to do is to go back to do something like he also thought you should do for the Greeks, which is to go back to experience the concepts as with their birth certificates, how they were originally in the ancient Greeks, how they were originally for the early Christians. So he thought that he thought, along with many people, including Cassirer and others, that the Jewish tradition didn't have philosophy, didn't have conceptual theoria, but it had this sort of practical way of expressing life as it is lived, as it were. Early, he talks about Erleben and Erlebnis, and the nature of living that has to be uncovered using its own terms. And he thinks the source to go to is St. Paul. Quite cleverly, he does this for a simple reason. I've never checked this, but I think he may be right, that the earliest fragment of a Christian text is a letter of Paul. So just like finding Heraclitus, the earliest letter is St. Paul, not the scriptures which were written later. So he does his Pauline thing. It's St. Paul's concepts that we have to deal with. Parousia is one of them. So this idea of presencing, of experiencing a kind of saving time that is transformative of time and all the rest of that, that he's finding, he thinks he has to articulate. And then he goes to people like Augustine and Luther. So the story, who he also thinks are Pauline. And so he uses Luther's commentary on Paul as one of his sources. So that's what Heidegger thinks he's doing in the reflection on religious life. Around the same time, this book came out by Gerda Walter on the phenomenology of the mystics, and he thinks this is terrible, largely because he hasn't written it. So he writes, he calls it Schwärmerei. He says it's sort of rubbish, mush, and he thinks that she has completely misunderstood the mystic, and he says he's going to do it. But in these references I'm making, that I've quoted there, where he's talking about Abgeschiedenheit, he talks about it as a primarily emotional way of relating to being entangled in world entanglement. And he thinks this is what's in Paul, in Paul, and he thinks it's in Eckhart. So he's using Eckhart as his way of reading all of that. So that's what he's overall doing. What somehow starts to happen, I think, Paul and Eckhart are giving you this idea, we've already arrived. This is the good news, we're already there. This is very much a Zen thing too. The other shore is this shore in the Heart Sutra, Yeah, going to the other shore is this shore. So we've already arrived. We're in the parousia. The kairos has transformed. We are already there. We're in the presence of the risen Jesus, as he thinks. This is what Paul is thinking. So what Heidegger is doing is sort of religifying that, if you like, and he's sort of saying, there's a new way of thinking about time in these early religious writings, which is completely different to what he sees as the largely Greek Platonic notion about the negativity of temporality. There's a new being in the present. And, this gelâzenheit, this letting be, is all part of that. So that's how he's trying to think, but he actually doesn't have the resources to do so. Something happens somewhere a little bit around that time where he starts reading more Kierkegaard and more of the anxiety, and that sort of comes in more. Because that's not in these earlier parts.
I think there is a footnote in referring to Kierkegaard, or a note in the notes at the back of the lectures. He mentioned those of Kierkegaard, but only just 1 second.
Yeah. So it becomes more important. I mean, later, what I don't know. I mean, God, it's a long time since I was reading about the evolution of being in time. What Theodore Cassel says. Earlier, I mean, if you read Gadamer, he claims that the big influence, the shift, is that Heidegger in these early religious texts is looking for a way of talking about living, practical living, and he's looking at Aristotle's the Nicomachean Ethics and the letters of Paul and things like that. How do we live practically in the awareness? But then he discovers Dilthey, who has a way of talking about life. And that becomes, I mean, according to Gadamer, this was the main text that was in Heidegger's Hut in 1923, and he was working on that and Aristotle in terms of the nature of Dasein and existence in the concrete sense. He's always said we'd work it out concretely. And he says that in these early religious lectures, he's trying to understand authentic, again, the idea of authenticity is certainly in there, authentic religious life as a concrete life. Yeah, sorry, I think.
All right,
You both
okay,
spoke.
then.
Somebody else.
There is also Bultmann. There is a memory of
Yes.
Bultmann on this.
Sorry, you say that, please?
There is also a memory written by Bultmann, the Buddha Bultmann.
Oh, yes, I've never read these.
Same life during
Yeah.
the Marburg years. When I
Yes.
was in Marburg and engaged in the talk within the Society of Theology.
Yes.
And there is Bultmann who claims the same.
Yeah, that's good. I'd like to be in company with Bultmann. I haven't read this book by are these the letters between Bultmann and Heidegger, or is this a book of Bultmann?
No, the letters between Bultmann and Heidegger exist, but they're going to be published in the Briefsausgabe
Yeah.
from the Halbe Verlag,
Yeah.
but there is still a long time.
Okay, thank you.
Could I take the conversation back towards the theme of irreligion, irreligious?
Yeah, whatever I do.
Irreligious.
Yeah. Ent religio, religiosen or something. I don't know. Must
Is
be a
that an
German.
actual term?
There is a term. Yeah, actually, that's sorry. I do now remember what I was struggling. Yeah. Yeah, to untheologize.
Yes,
And because now I remember, because in these lectures, he says about that Erlebnis had become Entlebnis. Right, that the devivification gets translated in the English.
Right.
This is a
Yeah.
mindfulness theme.
Yeah.
Because, one of the things about mindfulness is to get out of the way so you can
Yeah.
actually embrace the mystery. They often say, the Buddha, if you see the Buddha, kill him.
Yes.
In the way.
And Eckhart says, I pray God to rid me of God.
Yes.
And he keeps saying this to people, don't waste your time praying.
Yeah. Now, Heidegger puts this up, and Heidegger, is it a nascent mission on the part of Heidegger to develop a secular spiritual?
That's a good question. And certainly these later writings on Gelassenheit and openness to the mystery and what was it? Fragen is the questioning is the piety of thinking, I mean, there. Yeah. Yeah, Heidegger never left it. Bernard Welter wrote a lot on Eckhart, said the sermon on Eckhart's funeral, and
Yes.
he made the same point. There's no doubt that Eckhart is perhaps much more of an influence on Heidegger than Heidegger ever acknowledges. Eckhart was just becoming known, and Eckhart really pushed to have the student Käte Oltmanns get a job and everything. She was his first really prominent female student, and I don't know what happened. She married another German philosopher, and I've forgotten. And I know he was suspended for being a member of the National Socialist Party after the war. There was this connection that finding the roots of German thinking was also finding the uniquely German origin of thinking in general, for which Heidegger is also blameworthy. But sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's the bus will leave in 15 minutes. So let's move to the last two questions from people online. And then, so we have 7 minutes max and then we'll wrap it up. So Lisa Foran says, thanks so much, Dermot, for that great paper. Could you say something more on the role of possible, impossible? Derrida critiques Heidegger for in some way repeating the tradition of negative theology, replacing God with being. Yet Derrida is highly praiseworthy of Dionysius and others for a thinking of the impossible according to a different order. Do you think Heidegger took some of his own understanding of possible, impossible from Eckhart?
That's a good question, and I would have to think about that in the answer. I just know, because I've been just teaching a graduate course on Christian mysticism, that we did closely read Derrida's, especially his Jerusalem talk, and I think Derrida has a very narrow understanding of negative theology in that, and he's criticized by Jean-Luc Marion actually for that in a recent discussion. Derrida does quote Eckhart positively, especially Quasi Stella Matutina is the sermon like the star, like the morning star. And as you said, Dionysius, that I think he wants to think there's a genuineness to this tradition, but he criticizes Heidegger for over metaphysical, I mean, ironically, over metaphysicalizing it. But I just don't think Derrida came to this very late, and in his own essay, he admits this, that for years people had said to him his deconstruction, his Abbau, his negative thinking had been sounded like the negative theology of the tradition, and he'd ignore that. But then he goes to Jerusalem and very cleverly connects it with this idea of the Maimonides and the unknown God, and the God who can't be spoken and can't be said, and all the rest of it. So how to avoid speaking, denial, denégation, he uses the phrase, which can mean of negation or nichten, negating the negation. But it's a very subtle, like everything Derrida wrote, but finally, I think he came close to recognizing there was this tradition. Heidegger knew Eckhart, but didn't know the earlier versions of it. Didn't quote from Gregory of Nyssa or Maximus Confessor or the Greek tradition at all.
Okay, the penultimate question. Thank you from Petri. Thank you, Professor Moran. Great speech. Do you think that Zazen is one of the best ways to understand what this detachment experientially means? Does Eckhart himself have suggestions how to practice this detachment, a certain kind of methodic practice, as in Zen they have Zazen? Does Eckhart have something similar?
Well, Zazen is a very good practice. So if you want any practice, because again, it's as Nathalie Dupraz says, it's a one world culture. It's a way, Zazen is completely secularized, even in the Zen Buddhist tradition, that you don't need to have any like prior commitments in terms of belief structure to practice Zazen. Eckhart never. Eckhart's practice is one of letting go of images. This letting go, gelassen, leaving things be, let it be. It has a double one of leaving things alone and dropping them. And Eckhart does it primarily in terms of people attaching themselves to images. Now, I know because people all talk about the incense and gongs in Tibetan meditation, which is kind of like high mass in Catholicism. There's a lot of banging and chanting and knocking and high-tech stuff going on, and a lot of imaging. And Eckhart is drop all of that. And insofar as that is, Eckhart himself was preaching against the religiosity of some of the mystics in these convents, who went on to a very extreme form of fascination with images, such as you find in John of the Cross. If you ever want to see a real imagistic style of meditation, that's John of the Cross. But Eckhart's very much against that. So in that sense, this idea of emptying out the mind, of detaching oneself, of recognizing that you're already there in this empty space, that all has emphasis for practices, but there's nothing about the body or breathing or any of that in there.
So last question, and literally just 2 minutes if you could. Alex Obrigevich says, thank you, Dermot, for the great talk and answers. I was wondering if there is some link with the Abgrund of the nothing, the anterior withdrawal, and the spark of the soul you mentioned in humanity, as a sort of abyssal link in the existence of Dasein and the claim that the kingdom of heaven exists in the heart of humanity.
Well, I mean, the very term Abgrund is found in Eckhart. Abgrund means abyss, or black, ungroundedness, if you like, or non-grounding. And it's characterized by Eckhart and by that tradition, and explicitly as a form of nothingness or emptiness. And it is central to this tradition also to say that emptiness, Gelassenheit, Abgeschiedenheit, whatever you want to call it, belongs to God and belongs to the human, and that's what makes the two of them have the same nature, such that one is the image of the other. By the way, Eugen actually says they are images of each other. So not just that man is an image of God, but God is an image of man. So this idea that humanity is the manifestation of the divine, that's of course completely orthodox Christian. You know, in the beginning was the word, you know, in hologos, and the logos was made flesh. I mean, there's the very beginning of John's gospel is an assertion that the divine and the human have this hidden manifest relationship. So that is absolutely present in the heart of Heidegger and Eckhart, I would say. If that's the answer.
Okay, and with that question, let's all thank Professor Dermot Moran for his amazing speech.
Wow. Yeah.
So I would like to thank all the speakers who flew in from abroad, everyone who's participated in this and online. I would like to thank the students who were part of an awesome team, and I think we did a very good job. I'm very happy. I'd also like to thank Susie, who didn't make it, but we are working together, as I said, on the books that will come out. Finally, the University of Cyprus for sponsoring most of this conference, plus the other sponsors, which is the A.G. Leventis Foundation and the Deputy Ministry of Tourism. Let me remind you that you can still look up, get on the website, and we will upload information about this. The recordings will be uploaded somewhere. We'll see where it will go, but we will keep you updated on the website on the progress of this process. So thank you very much and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Crystal.